let's edit like Mindz-eye Photography. For those of you who don't know him, he has a very unique and dark editing style, especially when it comes to editing those medieval city shots. As always, you can follow along this tutorial by downloading the raw file from the link in the description of the video. And now let's jump right into it. For the editing process, I will be using the Camera Raw Editor for the raw adjustments and a bit of Photoshop for some finer editing later. We are working with an HDR image. That means we do have more dynamic range when it comes to the highlights and the shadows. That means we can just pull some more details out of them without risking any strange noise being added. So first I do want to apply a little bit of transformation since those vertical lines are kind of skewed, which I don't like. And that's the reason I also have already cropped the image, as you can see. So what I want to do first is let's head into the Geometry tab and then let's fix that by just dropping the vertical slider. And I'm just keeping a closer look on those windows right here. I'm just aiming for a straight vertical line going down the wall. So I need to bring that vertical slider down a little bit more, just like that. Then I am going to switch the profile going from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard, which helps with the darkest areas of the image and it also lessens the contrast a bit. Now let's expand the basic panel. First, I do want to adjust the white balance. And for that very unique editing style of Mindz-eye, I am aiming for a warmer image. That means I'm going to start by increasing the temperature. I'm mostly focused on those highlights here while increasing the temperature since we are going to introduce some blue tones later, mainly on the shadows. Then let's bring up the exposure, just getting some more details out of the shadows, and at the same time I'm bringing down the highlights. This will mostly affect the sky and of course those street lights. So that's looking pretty good. I do want to keep it more on the darker side in this case, but still I do want to bring up the shadows since we want to have some details in here. Let's raise them a little more, but that's looking fine. Also, I'm bringing up the blacks for the same effect. Just like that. Okay. And finally, I do want to bring up the whites. This will mainly help with a bit more contrast, but of course it will also make the highlights brighter. So let's not raise it too much, but I think this right here is a pretty good spot. And before we jump into the masking stuff, let's also add a bit of texture, giving those smaller details some more sharpness. And at the same time, I'm bringing down the clarity, which will add some kind of very soft look overall. And for the same effect, I'm going to slightly drop the dehaze, but here be careful since this will also make the image brighter. Okay, and finally we can bring up the vibrance a bit. And that's the image after the base adjustments. So we went from this to this. Still a pretty far way to go, so let's continue doing a bit of masking. First off, the easiest thing to do right away is to just introduce some more details on top of this cobblestone street. I'm doing this by using a radial gradient, just creating a point of interest somewhere around here. And I do want to bring up the whites, introducing some more brightness. I'm also going to pump up the clarity, which works really good on those wet cobblestones. And I'm also going to bring up the texture. Perfect. Then I want to work on the sky since this part at the moment is way too bright. To be honest, I should have taken this image a little later with the very dark night sky, but I can change that. So let's simply go use the sky selection right there. And with that sky selection, I'm simply going to bring down the exposure. And dropping the exposure makes the sky more vibrant, which I don't really like. We're aiming for a very desaturated blue tone in the sky, so let's bring down the saturation. Okay. I think I do want to add some kind of gradient in the sky, with the top part being darker and creating some more highlights in this area. So let's create another sky selection. And with this one, let's say subtract linear gradient. And I'm going to subtract the bottom part of this selection like this. And with the rest of it, I'm going to simply bring down the exposure, creating a very dark sky at the very top. Perfect. Now for the highlight part in this spot right there, I'm going to create yet another sky selection. This time, however, I'm going to click on those three dots, and here I'm choosing intersect mask width and choose radial gradient. Then let's drag up a radial gradient right there, place it just above this street lamp. And you can see we have a very solid selection here for the bottom part of the sky. And now just bring up the exposure. Wonderful. So let me just turn off those masks to see the difference from before to after. You see, it's very, very important to adjust things locally to get this Mindz-eye style right. For the next step, I do want to work on the center part, which needs some more highlights. Since in Mindz-eye images, there are always huge, very dark areas, but we also have a few selected bright areas. That's the reason for me to use a radial gradient created just right there over the center. Mainly want to target that store building right there. And I'm going to bring up the exposure. And this will immediately drive the attention of the viewer just to that building. Now, of course, we can further direct the attention. How can we do that? Let's create a linear gradient and target that building on the left. Just like that. And what I want to do with this linear gradient is to create some kind of vignetting effect. We can do that by bringing down the exposure and thus just making this part darker. Keep in mind, we don't want to make it too dark. We still want to have some details in here. So I'm not trying to underexpose too much. And let's do the same on the right side with another linear gradient. Just targeting that building right there and bring down the exposure. Wonderful. And finally, I do want to create a linear gradient for the very near foreground, just right here. And again, bring down the exposure. And that's how we create this custom vignetting effect. Here we have the image after the masking adjustments. Again, let me toggle the visibility from before to after. You can see the focus is now on the building in the center compared to before. Nice. Now let's also adjust the colors a little bit. This is by far the trickiest part, since Mindz-eye has a very, very, very unique look to his images. It's like a mixture of orange and blue tones. So let's first try set it up in the color mixer. I want to go into the hue tab and I want to bring down the yellow hue first, making all those yellow lights a little more orange-ish. I also want to bring down the orange hue for the same effect, just trying to make those orange tones stand out some more of this image. And just by applying those two changes, it certainly does look more like a Mindz-eye image. But we need to do a few more things here. Let's jump into the saturation stuff, and I want to bring down the saturation of most of the colors. So let's start with red, yellow, green, aqua, purple, and magenta. Now at this point I was really struggling. I think I do want to bring up the blue saturation a little bit, as well as the orange saturation. Maybe like this, but I will probably turn it down later in Photoshop, but for now I think it looks good. So let's just keep it that way. Finally, I do want to jump into the luminance tab, making the sky a bit darker by bringing down the blue luminance. Just like that, and maybe let's raise the orange luminance, adding some more highlights in the center of the image. Wonderful. So here we have the color mix adjustments before, after. Of course, we also do want to apply some split toning through the color grading panel. Let's start with the highlights. And of course, we need to apply an orange color tone for them. So let's set up the hue first. And I'm going to increase the saturation a lot. Maybe bring down the hue a bit, but that looks good. Then let's go into the midtones, and for both the midtones and the shadows, we need to apply a cold color tone so we won't get overwhelmed by those orange highlights. So for the midtones, set the hue to a cold color tone somewhere around here, And I think I'm going to use a higher amount of saturation than usual. I think that looks pretty good. Let's do the same with the shadows. Actually, I think I might also increase the luminance of the midtones, which will make them slightly brighter. Just want to tickle out some more details from the midtones here. Alright, and then for the shadows, I'm going to set up the hue again with a cold color tone and some saturation to make it visible. Alright, now at this point, again, I do want to work on the luminance, bringing it down, making the shadows slightly darker. Since, as I said earlier, Mindz-eye has a lot of very dark parts in this image, and I think we are missing this at that point. So bringing the luminance down for the shadows should help a bit, but I don't want to bring them down too much. Also, I think I need to work on the balance, since we do have a lot of orange tones. I think it's a bit too much, so I'm going to bring down the balance and in turn increase the amount of blue color tones in the image. Just like that. Wonderful. That's the image after the split toning, before, after. Very subtle, but I think it's going in the right direction. So what can we do next? Let's go into the effects tab and just add a little bit of vignetting. Just making the surrounding areas around the center a little darker. Don't want to go too crazy on the vignetting, but that should be fine. And finally, I'm going to head into the calibration tab, bringing the blue primary hue down and raising the saturation. Now we're almost done with the raw adjustments. Just want to sharpen this image real quick. And here we have the image after the raw adjustments. So we have started with this one, and now we are at this point. Pretty good, but still not looking like a Mindz-eye image. So let's open up this object. So just like with the albatross image, there is a ton of things going on inside of Photoshop. Let's start with the easiest task, and that is the cleaning up process. I'm just duplicating that image in case I mess something up. And then I'm grabbing the spot healing brush. Let's zoom in a bit, and I'm just getting rid of a few things which I find distracting. Alright, that should be good for now. Then one thing that is very common in the photography of Mindz-eye is some kind of subtle glow around highlights. And my preferred way of doing that is to create a new layer, and I'm going to switch the blending mode to hard light, grab the brush by pressing B, and we want to make sure the opacity of the brush is set to something very low, like around 10%. And then we need to set up the foreground color. We want to match it with the highlights of the lights. So I'm holding down the Alt key and click somewhere in here. It's looking like a pretty solid color. I do think I want to make it a little more orange, so I'm bringing down the color hue. And I want to make it a little desaturated, just like that. Perfect. Now with the brush set up, I am going to paint in a few glowing spots just around the highlights. Always just one brush stroke. We don't want to overdo it, just some kind of subtle glow effect. Alright, I think that should be enough. You can see it when I turn off this layer. It's pretty heavy actually, but I think I like it this way. Then let's make those highlights warmer. For that I'm going to use an adjustment layer. Go in the menu right there, and here we're choosing photo filter. And I'm going to bring up the density, which in turn will make it quite the heavy effect. But don't worry, I'm going to click on that layer mask then and hit Ctrl-I to invert it. So to make this effect visible, I'm again using the brush tool by pressing B, set the foreground color to white, and make sure the layer mask is selected. Now let's bring up the brush opacity again. Now I'm painting over every spot where I want the highlights to be warmer. So just like the street lamp and the store light in the center. That looks pretty good. You can see we now have the highlights right there in the center. We do actually have the sky included, which I don't really like, so I'm trying to mask it out. Just like that. I also want to add some kind of Orton Glow effect, I think. So let me merge every layer into one single layer by hitting Ctrl Shift Alt E. And with that layer, I'm going to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And just with those settings, I'm hitting OK. And let's switch the blending mode to lighter color. Of course, again, that's way too heavy, so we want to bring down the layer's opacity. I'm going to bring it down to around 10%, should be enough. And I want to apply a black layer mask so I can paint in the stroke more specifically. So I'm holding down the Alt key and click on the layer mask icon to instantly create a black layer mask. Then again, grab the brush, set the foreground color to white and paint in where we want to have that Orton Glow applied, mainly around the highlights. We want to keep it subtle, so that's looking very, very good. At this point, I do want to apply a little bit of dodging. And as always, if you have been watching some of my videos, you will know I'm doing this using the TK Panel plugin. So first off, let me create a new layer, switch the blending mode to overlay for the dodging effect. And then let's open up the TK Panel plugin. This is a paid plugin, but there is a free version available with all the needed tools for this editing tutorial. So what I want to do here is to make the highlights right there and maybe even in here a little brighter. We can do that by creating a luminosity mask. Here with this panel we can target certain luminance areas. So let's check out the lights. I think the lights 1 mask should work pretty good. We have a pretty good selection right here. So I'm going to set the mode to layer mask and click on lights 1. Now this luminosity mask got applied on the overlay layer, on which we can now paint in with a white foreground color. Let's bring down the brush opacity, however. And now I'm starting to paint in some highlights right there. Mainly in the center, because keep in mind we want the sides of the image to be very, very dark. Nice. I can turn off this dodging layer so you can see the difference before, after. Especially in the foreground, this looks really gorgeous. At this point, one thing that is really bothering me is the sky. This is way too blue and it's also kind of a strange hue. So let's go apply a hue saturation adjustment layer. In the drop down menu, let's choose the cyan tones, bring up the hue slightly. We want to have a nice blue color tone in here. And I also want to bring down the saturation. Since keep in mind, the images of Mindz-eye are usually rather desaturated. So I think this looks pretty good. Could play around with the luminance as well, making it a bit darker. Just like that. Let me also head into the blue channel and bring down the saturation here. I really want to desaturate the sky like this. I can turn off this adjustment layer so you can see the difference from before to after again. And that puts us much, much closer to the desired look. But I'm still not happy with that sky. So next up, I'm going to create another sky selection. So let's pick the layer from below to be able to target the sky. I'm going to select. Here we're choosing sky. With that selection active, let's go back to the top and create a new layer and click on layer mask. So with this layer, I want to darken the sky. So I'm going to set the blending mode to overlay and I want to make the top part darker again. I'm not going to use the brush tool. Instead, let's use the gradient tool and I'm going to set the foreground color to black. And here you can see I have a gradient setup going from black to transparent. With this, I'm just going to drag it down like this and make the top part of the sky darker. Obviously, this is way too much at the moment. So we want to bring down the opacity to a point where it looks a little more natural. Just like that. Wonderful. Okay, I think we are getting really, really close. I want to add some more contrast. So let's create a curves adjustment layer. What I want to do is to bring down the shadows, so I'm going to add a point right there and drag it down. At the same time, I do want to raise the blacks just to kind of create this faded blacks effect. And then for more contrast, I'm going to create a point right there in the highlights. Just slightly drag it up like this. Don't want to go too crazy, but I think this is looking pretty good. And again, we can make use of that layer mask. So grab the brush tool. I'm going to set the foreground color to black this time because I want to get rid of certain parts of that curve. So like here in the foreground, I want to brush over this part, getting back those highlights, and right there in the center, making the image brighter again. Because remember, we want to have the focal point right there on that building. The surrounding areas are not that important and they should be rather dark. So that's looking really, really good. Then again, let's merge everything into a single layer. Again, I'm just using the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-Alt-E. With this layer, what I want to do next is to add more details to the cobblestone, but also to those walls on both sides. You could play around with Photoshop, of course, but I want to do it in another faster way, and that is the Nik Collection plugin. So let's do just that. And here we are going to choose the detail extractor. This looks very weird at first, but don't worry. I want to bring up the details and I want to bring up the contrast. And I think the saturation is fine for now. So let's just apply it like this. Okay, at this point we want to make use of a layer mask again. So hold down the Alt key, click on layer mask, and this effect is gone. To reveal it, we are going to use the brush with the foreground color set to white. And we want to bring down the brush opacity since we want to only have a very tiny amount of this effect. And as I said, I want to have it over the cobblestone. So I'm just going to brush in with that white foreground color brush. Going to add a little more detail in here, as well as on that side wall. Okay, that looks great. It also helps introducing some more highlights in the center. What I want to do next is to fix the vertical lines some more. I really don't like doing this because it's a very annoying job, but let's do it. Again, I want to merge everything, and with that new layer, let's head into the edit menu and choose perspective warp. Now with the perspective warp tool, we can do some pretty crazy things. What I want to do is to create a grid right for this building on the right. So once I set up the first grid, I'm going to align it to the building. Just like this maybe. And let's give it a try. I'm going to click on warp. And let's see. See, that's why I don't like this. I'm just not used fixing vertical lines of a city image like this, but I think we can get a pretty good result by doing it like that. So I think let's hit OK. I'm going to deactivate the top layer so we can see the difference from before to after. And I think we did a pretty good job. You can see this is looking much better with the straight line as well as this side, and of course the building's edge as well. So I'm actually quite happy with this. There are just some gaps going on. I'm going to crop this image a little bit further. Actually, let's just fill that gap up there with the spot healing brush. Then I do want to desaturate the image even more, since I'm always checking the reference image on the second screen. And at this point, one thing that's really noticeable is how those yellow lights stand out a little bit too much. So let's create another hue saturation adjustment layer, go into the yellow tones and just bring down the saturation a notch. So I think this looks pretty good. And then I want to apply some more color grading by going to the adjustment layers and use a gradient map. Again, this looks super weird at first, but don't worry. We want to change the blending mode to soft light. And we also want to bring down the opacity, just like that. And then let's click on that gradient. What this thing does, on the left side, we can define which color should be applied on the shadows. And on the right side, we can define the colors which should be applied on the highlights. So in a kind of way, it's like split toning. for this image, I want to make the shadows colder with more blue color tones. So let's click on here, go into the blue color range and choose a blue cold color tone. Keep in mind, as we go further down into the darker areas, the image will get darker as well in the shadows. So we can make use of that if we want. So I think that's a pretty good spot right there. All right. And we don't want to have blacks on the highlights. Instead, we want to have some orange tones. Maybe like this. Okay, let's apply it like that. Turning it off, you can see the difference from before to after. You can play around with the opacity if you want, but I think this looks pretty good so far. Actually, let me adjust those shadows some more, giving them a more saturated blue tone. So the color is really visible in the shadows. Just like that. Okay, now there's one more thing that I want to do, and that is to apply another curves adjustment layer. The reason for me to do that is because I want to fade the blacks some more. So I'm creating a point right there. Let's bring it down a little bit. And then to fade the blacks, I'm picking up the black point and raise it a bit. And this should be enough actually. I could again play around with highlights, bringing it up slightly. And then maybe mask out a few areas one more time using a black brush. But here we have the finished image, I guess. So I would say this is looking pretty close to the Mindz-eye look. Of course, the conditions were not perfect because I should have taken this image a little bit later in the night. Otherwise, I'm very happy with this. So if you have any questions left, feel free to ask in the comments, and thank you very much for watching this video.